November 14, 1934. Consolidated Coal Seam Number 7, Fayette County, Pennsylvania. A man named Earl Puskarich places his palm flat against a timber support beam at the mouth of the number 4 slope entry and holds it there for 3 seconds. He is feeling for vibration. He is feeling for the low, wet tremor that travels through old-growth oak faster than sound travels through air. He feels nothing, which means the men below are not moving. He pulls a dollar watch from his breast pocket, a Waltham, the kind sold at hardware counters for 98 cents, and notes the time. 4:47 in the morning. The men went down at midnight. They should have signaled the hoist at 3 o'clock. They have not signaled. Earl Puskarich closes the watch. He does not run. He does not shout. He turns to the 2 men standing behind him and says, with the particular flatness of a man who has worked underground for 22 years, "Get the rope, men, get the shovels, and somebody wake the foreman." There is a particular kind of silence that lives at the top of a coal mine shaft at 4 in the morning. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of held breath. It is the silence of men standing at the surface who know, in the way that miners always know, through instinct and mathematics and the accumulated weight of 20 years of close calls, that something below them has gone wrong. The Consolidated Coal Company's Fayette County operations ran what were called slope mines, not the vertical shaft mines you might picture, no cage dropping straight down into darkness. Slope mines follow the angle of the coal seam itself. The entry tunnels driven at a grade of 8 to 12 degrees, descending into the earth like a throat. Men walked in, they walked down. The further they walked, the further they were from air, from light, from the surface, and from any help that might reach them. On the morning of November 14, 1934, 4 men were working the overnight low coal section of seam number 7. Their names were George Vargo, Pete Stankovic, Donald Bryce, and a man listed in the company records only as Horvath J. They were cutting coal from a section of the seam that had been flagged 2 weeks earlier as requiring additional timbering. The mine superintendent had signed off on a work order. The timbering had not yet been done. This is the part of the story that the company's official account would later describe, in 4 careful words, as a scheduling oversight. The men below did not call it that. The men below called it nothing at all, because by 4:47 in the morning, they had been sealed behind a collapsed section of the mine's number 4 slope entry for approximately 90 minutes, and they had no way of calling anything anything. What Earl Puskarich knew, standing at the mouth of that entry with his palm on a wet oak beam, was this: 4 men were somewhere between 400 and 600 feet down a collapsed tunnel. He did not know if they were breathing. He did not know if they had water. He did not know if the collapse was a single event or whether the ceiling was still moving. What he knew was that the only way to find out was to go in. The number 4 slope entry ran 680 feet from its surface portal to its working face. It had been in operation for 11 years. The timbers supporting its roof and walls were original. 11 years old, soaked with groundwater, compressed under the weight of the overburden above, and in several documented sections, visibly bowed. The men working the overnight shift had gone in at midnight with 4 carbide lamps, 2 hand drills, a charge of blasting powder, and their tools. Standard, routine. They had been in that section dozens of times. What nobody on the surface knew yet, what would take several hours and considerable risk to determine, was the precise nature and location of the collapse. A mine collapse is not a single clean event. It is not a door closing. It is a process. Rock and timber and compressed earth under enormous overburden pressure do not simply fall in one motion. They move, they settle, they find new load paths, and sometimes in the hours after an initial collapse, they move again. The question Earl Puskarich could not answer standing at the surface portal was the same question that would drive every decision made in the next 31 hours. Where had the entry collapsed, and how much of it? If the collapse was near the working face, near the men, then there was a chance they had space behind it. Coal seam tunnels, when they collapse, often leave what miners call the pocket, a void behind the fallen material where a man could sit or lie or simply breathe. If the pocket held, and if the men were in it, they might be alive. If the collapse was widespread, if it had progressed for 100 feet or 200 feet of the tunnel, then the work of reaching them would be something else entirely. Earl Puskerich took a carbide lamp from the crate near the tunnel mouth. He lit it. He looked at the two men behind him, a rope man named Casimir Dolak and a company laborer whose name is not recorded, and he walked into the tunnel. He made it 140 feet before the ceiling stopped him. Earl Puskerich was not, by most accounts, an impressive-looking man. He was 44 years old in 1934. He stood 5 feet 9. He had started in the mines at age 14, which was not unusual in Fayette County in 1904. He had a wife named Margaret and 3 daughters. He lived in a company house on Vargo Street, a coincidence of address that would become quietly significant by the end of this story, and he kept a vegetable garden in the back that his neighbors remembered as being remarkably productive given the soil quality. He was a mine examiner. This is an important distinction. A mine examiner was not a supervisor in the managerial sense. He did not sit in an office. He walked. His job, every shift, was to walk the active entries and working sections of the mine before the men went in, checking for gas with a flame safety lamp, checking for roof movement, checking for loose ribs, testing the timber with his knuckles, reading the mine the way a farmer reads weather. His tools were a short-handled pick, a flame lamp, a chalk marker for flagging danger points, and 30 years of accumulated knowledge stored in his hands and his chest and the soles of his feet. What distinguished Earl Puskerich, according to the men who worked around him, was not courage in the dramatic sense, it was patience. When other men faced a problem underground, a stuck drill, a misfired blast, a section of roof that had begun to creep, they moved quickly, they improvised, they relied on speed and strength. Puskerich moved differently. He would stand and look at a problem for a long time. He would touch it, he would walk around it, or in the case of a tunnel, walk toward it and then back, toward it and back, reading it from different angles. The men called it not unkindly his surveying habit. Standing 140 feet into the number 4 slope entry, lamp raised, looking at a solid wall of collapsed timber, rock, and clay, Earl Puskerich surveyed. He stood there for approximately 4 minutes. Then he went back to the surface. He told the men waiting there, "It's packed solid from the ceiling to the floor. Mixed material. Timber, rock, clay, coal fines. We don't drill. We don't blast. We dig." The Fayette County coal fields of southwestern Pennsylvania had been in continuous industrial production since the 1880s. By 1934, this was not a young industry. It was a mature one, which in mining terms means an industry that has already consumed its easiest resources and is now working deeper, working older sections, working seams that the previous generation had left alone for reasons that were rarely documented and often prudent. The Consolidated Coal Company had been operating seam number 7 since 1923. The seam was bituminous coal, soft coal, as opposed to the anthracite that Pennsylvania's northeastern counties were known for. Bituminous seams in Fayette County ran at thicknesses ranging from 3 to 5 feet. The working sections required men to move through passages that, in the lower sections, were not tall enough to stand upright. Men worked on their knees, they worked on their sides, they loaded coal into cars that were hauled out by mules or, in the more modern operations, by electric motors. The number 4 slope entry was one of 4 active entries feeding seam number 7 by 1934. It served the deepest working section of the mine. The coal in this section was good, high BTU, low sulfur, the kind that the steel furnaces of Pittsburgh paid a premium for. It was also coal that sat beneath a particularly unpredictable layer of what geologists call fire clay, a soft plastic formation that behaves under pressure, less like rock and more like slow-moving mud. Fire clay does not crack cleanly, it flows, and when it flows into whatever space is available, including the spaces inside timbered mine entries. The mine had a documented history of roof trouble. Company records from 1931 and 1932 show repeated entries by mine examiners, including Earl Puskerich, flagging specific sections of the number 4 slope for additional timbering. Several of those flags appear to have been addressed. Several do not show corresponding work orders. By 1934, the United States was 5 years into the Great Depression. The Consolidated Coal Company was, like most coal operators in the region, running lean. Maintenance was deferred. Timbering schedules slipped. Men who might have been assigned to support work were assigned instead to production work, because production was what paid the bills. This was not unique to one company. It was the condition of an industry in a depression. What it meant in practical terms was that the roof above the overnight crew in seam number 7's number 4 slope entry had been carrying more weight for longer with less support than any mine examiner would have approved. And on the night of November 13th, at some point between midnight and 3 in the morning, it had made its decision. By 6 in the morning, Earl Puskerich had assembled what resources were available. These were 11 men from the day shift, which had been pulled from its normal assignments, 3 short-handled picks, 4 shovels with the handles cut to 18 inches to allow use in the tunnel's constricted space, a come-along, a manual ratchet winch for moving heavier debris pieces, 2 wooden mine cars, their wheels fitted with rope handles to allow them to be dragged manually through sections too tight for the mule-drawn track, and the mules themselves, 2 of them, stationed at the surface to haul debris cars out of the entry once they were loaded. The plan was, in theory, simple. Dig through the collapse from the surface side, creating a passage large enough for a man to crawl through. Remove the debris in controlled stages. Timber as you go. The problem revealed itself within the first 2 hours. The collapse material was not loose. This was the condition that Earl Puskerich had been trying to assess during his 4 minutes of standing and looking at the debris wall. What he had seen, what he had confirmed by striking the surface of the debris with his pick 3 times in different locations, was that the material was not a pile of fallen objects. It was a compressed mass. When an underground entry collapses under the weight of fireclay overburden, the material does not simply fall, it is pushed. The overburden, the hundreds of feet of rock and earth above the seam, continues to exert its pressure downward. The collapsed material is not simply lying in the tunnel, it is being held in place under active, ongoing compression. Every piece of it is locked against every adjacent piece. The clay, in particular, has flowed into the spaces between the rock and timber fragments and hardened into something with the consistency of compressed concrete. You could not simply dig into this with a shovel. A shovel blade deflected off the clay surface. You could not blast, not without risking further collapse of the remaining tunnel sections, and not without the near certainty of killing the men you were trying to save. Compressed air drills were available, but using one would require time to run an air line from the surface compressor, and the vibration of a pneumatic drill in a tunnel already under active roof pressure was a decision that needed to be made very carefully. Puskerich decided against the drill. He decided for the pick. Short-handled, swung in a space where a man could not raise his arms fully above his head, the pick worked by driving its point into the clay rock matrix and levering, prying pieces loose one at a time. A man lying on his side in a tunnel 44 inches high, swinging a pick with a shortened handle, can move perhaps 3 cubic feet of compressed material in an hour. The debris wall they were facing was approximately 25 feet deep. At 3 cubic feet per man per hour, with 2 men working simultaneously in the confined space, moving 25 feet of compressed debris would take at minimum 15 to 20 hours of continuous work. That was if the debris did not extend further than the initial probe suggested. Here is what you need to understand about hand-digging a mine collapse in 1934. The tunnel is 44 inches high. Take a standard wooden screwdriver from a kitchen drawer, the kind with a thick handle, maybe 12 inches long. Now imagine lying on your side on a stone floor, that screwdriver in your hand, trying to chip away a wall of material that has the consistency of road base compacted by a steamroller. You can move your arm perhaps 8 inches at the elbow. You cannot swing. You cannot drive. You can push and lever and pick. That is the motion, 8 inches of arc, repeated several thousand times per hour. The issue is not strength. The men in that tunnel in 1934 were, by the standards of any era, extraordinarily strong. 20 years of underground manual labor produces a particular kind of physical capability, compact, enduring, built for sustained output in constrained positions. The issue is leverage. Leverage requires room. Room requires space. In a 44-inch tunnel, space is the one thing that is not available. The debris wall compounds this. The fireclay matrix that has bonded the collapsed material is, in its compressed, partially dried state, harder than the coal itself. It does not crack. It does not fracture. It yields by small increments, each pick strike removing perhaps a cubic inch of material. The large rock plates that are embedded in the clay can sometimes be pried loose along their natural fracture lines, but doing so requires finding those fracture lines first, which requires light, which requires a lamp positioned close enough to illuminate the surface while the man is working, which requires a second man holding a lamp just behind the first. So the working configuration is this: 2 men in the forward position, the lead man lying on his side or kneeling depending on the current profile of the debris face, working the pick. The second man directly behind him holding a lamp. A third man further back with a short shovel, moving the loosened material into a mine car. A fourth man at the car, loading and signaling. This is, effectively, a 4-man pipeline for moving 3 cubic feet of compressed material per hour. Every 20 minutes the lead man rotates out. Not because of regulations or schedules, because the work destroys your hands in 20 minutes. The picks had wooden handles, and the repeated shock of striking compressed clay travels up the handle into the palm and wrist in a way that, after 20 minutes, makes it difficult to grip the handle. Men wrapped their palms with canvas strips cut from old ventilation brattice cloth. It helped. It did not help enough. What kept them moving was a calculation that each man was doing continuously, without needing to speak it aloud. Somewhere between 140 feet from the surface and approximately 500 feet from the surface, the location of the working face, 4 men were either alive in a pocket of air, or they were not, and the only way to resolve that equation was to keep moving the pick. By 2 in the afternoon, they had moved 12 feet into the debris. This was slower than the theoretical 3 cubic feet per hour because the material in the upper section of the debris, directly beneath the collapsed roof, was a mixture that included large pieces of the original timbering. Old-growth oak timber, when compressed and soaked with groundwater for 11 years, becomes extraordinarily heavy. A single 6-foot timber section, 3 inches by 6 inches, soaked with water and locked in clay, weighs close to 80 pounds. Moving it in a 44-inch tunnel requires getting it free of the clay matrix first, which takes time, and then moving it backward through the tunnel by hand, which requires 2 men to pass it end to end in a space where they cannot stand. The come-along helped with some pieces, not all. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, the mine's ventilation foreman came to Earl Puskarich with a reading from his flame safety lamp that required attention. The flame safety lamp is a specific instrument. It works on the principle that a methane-enriched atmosphere will cause the lamp's internal flame to change character, elongating, acquiring a blue cap above the yellow flame, becoming what miners called a blue haze. The size and quality of the blue cap tells an experienced man the approximate concentration of methane in the air. The reading showed a small but definite blue cap. Methane, called fire damp in the mining trade, is a product of coal seams. It accumulates in pockets in the coal, and it leaks into the air continuously. Normal mine ventilation, the circulation of fresh air through the entries, driven by the large surface fans, keeps methane concentrations well below dangerous levels. But the collapse of the number 4 slope entry had disrupted the mine's ventilation circuit. The air moving through the rescue tunnel was not circulating, it was stagnating. The danger threshold for methane is approximately 1.5% by volume. The lamp reading suggested they were approaching, not at, but approaching, that threshold in the forward section of the tunnel. This introduced a second problem layered onto the first. Working with carbide lamps in a methane atmosphere is, at concentrations above the threshold, an invitation to explosion. Carbide lamps produce an open flame. Open flames ignite methane. This is the reason that the coal mining industry killed more men in the first 3 decades of the 20th century than any other single occupation in America. Puskarich had 2 choices: stop work until ventilation could be restored, which meant running a ventilation line, brattice cloth, and auxiliary fan through the rescue tunnel, a job that would take 3 to 4 hours. Or continue work with reduced crew and open lamps, accepting the risk, accepting that the men they were digging toward might not have 3 to 4 hours. He chose to continue, reduced crew, open lamps, and he sent 2 men back to begin setting up the ventilation line as fast as they could manage. He rotated himself into the lead digger position. By 7 in the evening, 14.5 hours after the men went down, Earl Puskarich sat down in the tunnel during a rotation break and did not immediately stand back up. This was noted by Casimir Dolak, the rope man who had been with Puskarich since before dawn. Dolak later told a company safety investigator that this was the only time in the entire rescue operation that he saw Puskarich stop moving with purpose. The progress report at that hour was this: 19 feet of debris cleared, possibly 6 feet remaining before they broke through to any void space. The ventilation line had been partially run. They had managed to push a length of brattice cloth duct roughly 60 feet into the tunnel, which had reduced the methane reading enough for the ventilation foreman to clear continued work. 3 men had been rotated out to the surface for medical attention, 2 with hand injuries severe enough to prevent continued use of the pick, 1 with what appeared to be a mild case of afterdamp poisoning from exposure to carbon monoxide in the poorly ventilated forward section. The crew was down to 7 effective workers. The temperature inside the tunnel was approximately 54 degrees. The floor was wet. The ceiling at the forward face was, in 2 sections, showing fresh movement. Small amounts of new material sifting down from cracks that had not been there that morning. This was not necessarily alarming. Post-collapse settling is normal. But it required watching. What Puskarich was sitting with in those minutes against the tunnel rib was a calculation he could not resolve with the available data. 19 feet of debris cleared in 14 hours. 6 feet remaining, maybe more. The gap between where they were and where the men might be was, in physical terms, a matter of hours. But the men had been sealed behind the collapse for nearly 18 hours. The air supply in an unventilated void behind a mine collapse, a sealed pocket, is not unlimited. It depends on the size of the pocket, the number of men in it, and whether any fresh air is percolating through the collapsed material. The fire clay matrix that was making their digging so difficult was also almost certainly making it nearly impossible for air to reach the men from the surface side. Puskarich understood this without needing to calculate it formally. He had been in mines his entire life. He understood what 18 hours in a sealed pocket meant. He sat against the rib for perhaps 4 minutes. Then he wrapped his hands again, picked up his shortened pick, and moved back to the forward position. The pivot was not dramatic. It almost never is. At approximately 9:15 in the evening, Puskarich was working the upper section of the debris face, specifically the zone where the debris mass contacted the right-hand rib of the tunnel. In slope mines, the rib is the coal seam wall. Coal, unlike the fire clay above it, does not flow. It holds its shape. And where the flowing clay had pressed the debris mass against the rib, there was, in places, a narrow zone where the 2 materials had not fully bonded. Puskarich had been aware of this zone for several hours. He had not pursued it because initially the gap was not large enough to matter. But as the debris face moved back, as more material was removed from the central section, the pressure on the debris mass was subtly redistributing itself. The gap at the upper rib corner was widening. He stopped. He looked at it for a long time. He pushed his lamp into the gap and looked along it. The gap ran, as best he could determine, along the rib line, angling upward with the seam's natural dip. It was not in itself a passable opening. It was 4 inches wide, perhaps 8 inches tall, but it was running in the right direction, and the material in and around it was looser than the central debris mass. Not loose, looser. He called back to the men behind him. "Bring up the narrowest pick we have." The narrowest pick in the inventory was a clay pick, a tool originally designed for trimming the floor in low coal sections, with a head that was elongated and narrow rather than the standard broad wedge. The handle on this one had been cut to 14 inches. Puskarich took it. He turned onto his back in the tunnel, positioned himself beneath the upper rib gap, and began working upward into it at an angle. He was not trying to widen the gap for himself to pass through. He was trying to collapse it in a controlled direction, to bring the material in the gap down into the already cleared section of the tunnel, rather than letting it redistribute upward and forward where it might close the gap entirely. It was a demolition move used in careful sequence. Weaken the top, let it fall, remove the fallen material, advance. In simpler terms, he had found a seam in the wall, and he was going to split it. The clay pick worked. It took 40 minutes of sustained effort working the upper rib gap. Puskarich rotated with one other man, a younger miner named Stefan Dobrescu, who had come in on the second shift and had been working since early afternoon. They took turns working the narrow clay pick upward and laterally into the upper gap, while the men behind them managed the fallen material. The sealing of the gap, where the fire clay overburden met the edge of the debris mass, was the key. It was less consolidated than the central mass. The years of water infiltration from the fireclay layer above had created a zone of partially degraded material. Not soft, but not locked. The clay pick, narrow enough to work in the constricted space, found purchase. At approximately 10:40 in the evening, a section of the upper gap material, approximately 3 feet long and 18 inches high, came down in a controlled cascade. Puskarich, expecting it, had already pulled back. The material fell forward into the already cleared section and was shoveled back within 15 minutes. What it revealed was not a passage, not yet, but it revealed a profile in the debris face that was fundamentally different from what they had been working against for the past 16 hours. The collapsed material in the new upper section was broken differently. It had shear planes through it, lines of weakness, places where the clay pick could find edges and work them. They moved the next 18 inches of debris in just over 2 hours. This required reconfiguration. As the new upper section was opened, the working profile expanded, not from a flat vertical face, but in an L shape, widening upward and to the right along the rib. This was not an ideal shape for getting a man through, but it was workable. It was in fact the passage. Puskarich reorganized the rotation. 2 men worked the L-shaped passage simultaneously, one in the lower central section, one working the upper section lying on his back. The debris was passed back hand to hand in a chain that extended 30 feet behind them before reaching a mine car. They were now moving faster than they had moved at any point in the rescue. Not fast, but faster. At approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, November 15th now, 25 hours since the 4 men had gone down, Casimir Dolak, working the forward lower position, drove his short shovel into the debris face and found no resistance on the forward stroke. He stopped. He pushed the shovel forward again. Empty space. He said, quietly, to the man behind him. The opening was not large. 18 inches wide, maybe 22 inches tall at its highest point. A man could get through it. Not easily, but through. Puskarich went first. He pushed the carbide lamp through ahead of him, and then followed it, head first, pulling himself forward with his forearms on the tunnel floor. The edges of the passage were rough. Broken rock, timber splinters, compacted clay. He cleared them with his shoulders by compressing his arms forward and rotating slightly. It took approximately 45 seconds. On the other side, he stood. The void behind the collapse was approximately 12 feet long, 7 feet wide, and maintained the tunnel's full 44-inch height. It was a pocket, exactly the kind of void that forms when a collapse does not fully consolidate, when the material finds a new load path and leaves an airspace behind it. He raised his lamp. George Vargo was sitting against the left rib with his back against the coal, his knees drawn up, his hands on his knees. He was alive. He was looking at the light. Pete Stankovich was lying on his side in the center of the pocket. He was breathing. He did not move when the light came in, but his chest was moving. Donald Bryce was near the far end of the pocket, closest to the working face that the men had been at when the collapse happened. He was sitting upright with his lamp, long since gone out, in his lap. He said when the light reached him, "We thought you'd be sooner." The 4th man, Horvath J., was unconscious near the right rib, lying flat on his back. His breathing was audible, slow and shallow, but present. They had been in the pocket for 25.5 hours. The air in the pocket smelled of carbon dioxide and coal dust, and the particular metabolic exhalation of 4 men breathing in a sealed space for more than a day. Puskarich's flame safety lamp, when he checked it, showed no methane. The coal at the working face was exhausted in that section. What the men had been breathing for the last several hours was air with substantially reduced oxygen. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to produce the profound exhaustion and altered consciousness that Stankovic and Horvath were showing. Puskarich went back to the passage and called through it, "All 4. Alive. Get the rope and a timber stretcher for one." The sound that came back through the hole, a relay of voices passing the word back through 30 men strung across 230 feet of tunnel, was not a cheer. It was something quieter. An exhale, the sound of men releasing something they had been holding for a very long time. George Vargo, Pete Stankovic, and Donald Bryce were brought out through the passage under their own power, crawling, pulling themselves through the 18-inch opening, helped by hands reaching through from the rescue side. It took approximately 40 minutes to get all 3 through the passage and then back through the 230-foot length of cleared tunnel. Horvath was brought out on the timber stretcher, 2 short boards with rope lashed between them, narrow enough to pass through the opening with a man on it. Getting an unconscious man through an 18-inch gap on a stretcher is a problem that requires patience and silence and specific mechanical thinking. It required removing the stretcher's binding on one side, sliding Horvath through loose, and resecuring him on the other side before moving him down the tunnel. Kazimir Dolek, who had been in the tunnel since 4:47 in the morning, was the man who managed this. He later received no formal recognition for it. His name appears in the State Mine Inspection Report as Rope Man C. Dolek. That is the extent of his recorded presence in the official account. A company physician who had been standing at the surface since early afternoon examined all 4 men. Vargo had a laceration on his forearm, apparently from the initial collapse. Stankovic had contusions to his lower back. Bryce appeared uninjured. Horvath, Josef Horvath, which is what the hospital record eventually gave as his full name, was taken by automobile to the county hospital, where he was treated for anoxia and released 4 days later. All 4 men survived. The official state mine inspection report, filed in December 1934, ran to 11 pages. It cited the failure to complete the timbering work order. It recommended procedural improvements. It assessed no penalties. The language of the report's conclusion described the rescue operation as reflecting creditably on the mine's supervisory personnel and workers. Earl Puskarich went home that morning at approximately 4:00 a.m. He walked the half-mile to his house on Vargo Street. His wife Margaret had been awake since the evening before, when word had reached the company houses. She made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. He put his wrapped hands flat on the table, which is how she knew he had been in the forward position. He slept for 11 hours. The following day, he returned to work. There is a kind of knowledge that does not exist in any document. It does not exist in the Consolidated Coal Company's Operations Manual. It does not exist in the state mine inspection reports, which are meticulous about compliance and nearly silent about competence. It does not exist in the training programs that the company ran for new workers, which covered safety regulations and timbering standards and the proper use of the flame safety lamp. It exists in 22 years of walking underground before the men go in. It exists in the habit of pressing a palm to a wet timber beam and knowing, from the quality of the silence that comes back, whether something below is wrong. It exists in the ability to stand in front of a wall of compressed clay and broken rock for 4 minutes and understand, without instruments, that the center will not yield, but the upper corner might. It exists in knowing when to swing the pick and when to put it down and think. Earl Puskarich worked in the mines for another 12 years after 1934. He retired in 1946. He continued to keep his garden on Vargo Street until 1961, when he and Margaret moved to live with their oldest daughter in Ohio. He died in 1967. There is no obituary in the record that mentions November 14, 1934. There is no plaque at the portal of what was the Consolidated Coal Company's No. 4 slope entry, which was sealed and reclaimed sometime in the late 1950s. The ground above it grows over clean. This is how most of these stories end, not with monuments, with silence and continuity, the next shift going in, the same hill, the same entry, the same calculation being made by the man whose job it is to know, before the men go down, whether it is safe for the men to go down. Most of the time, it is. When it is not, someone like Earl Puskarich presses his palm to the wet timber and notes the time and says with the flatness of a man who has decided what he is going to do, "Get the shovels."